Welcome to The Lead Climb, the podcast where we break down the strategies that drive patient acquisition and growth in behavioral health. Hosted by Growth Sherpa Consulting, we bring you expert insights on digital marketing, admissions, business development, and more, so your treatment center, mental health clinic, or private practice can thrive. Whether you're a CEO, admissions director, or marketing pro, this is where you'll find the tools to scale smarter. Follow us up the mountain. Let's lock in. Good morning and welcome to another awesome episode of the Lead Climb podcast presented by Growth Sherpa. Chris Foust here with an amazing guest. I'm so excited to have the behavioral health renaissance man himself, Brian O'Shea.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here.
Well, we're honored to have you. Brian, we go back a long time. Well, a long time to me. I believe we met at a Foundations Recovery Network conference event maybe 12 years ago.
Oh, at least every bit. Yeah.
But you made such a wonderful impression. And, I'm so glad that we get to have this conversation and talk about, where you've been and what you're planning on doing and what's the future for Brian O'Shea. But before we delve deep into what's happening for you now, I'd love to hear about your career, and I'd love to hear about how you've ended up where you are.
Thank you very much. So, born and raised the early years in the Bronx, part of the good Irish immigrant community there, and very fortunate. It was a great time, the 50s and 60s in the Bronx. I had my Irish community. There was a strong Italian community that part of my family had married into, and there was a strong Jewish community. And I'm so grateful for that. Having those three communities growing up, it was a magical time. It was a great time, the Bronx, in the 50s and the 60s. And then we moved out to Long Island. My father was a Navy career guy, and then he went into banking. And it was a fascinating thing to watch that all evolve. He ended up helping write the Truth in Lending bill. That was the first law for credit cards. And so it was a fascinating time. The 60s and 70s were a complex time. And I was very lucky. And then in behavioral health, in 1980, I want to get this correct, 1986, 87, I was part of a small team that did group work at the Pilgrim State Hospital out in Brentwood, Long Island, which was a very large facility. And I was part of a team helping with the peer support meetings there. And it was a fascinating thing to do. I learned so much. And then my life included working in the medical supply field for a very long time. And then I worked with shipper management. And then I ended up coming on a long vacation that I had to Jackson, Mississippi, 1 year after September 11th, because I've always had family there and I had visited there throughout my early life. And I ended up staying in Jackson, Mississippi. And part of it was I was never as successful as one would find helpful in New York. New York City, it was a great place to live, but I was always about $150,000 short every year of what I needed. Other than that, it was perfect. Lots of Broadway shows, the ocean's nearby. So I ended up going back to school in Mississippi and living in Mississippi, thanks to my wonderful aunt and uncle and cousins there. And while I was there, I was recruited into behavioral health by a couple of very powerful people in the behavioral health field who were, without question, the most prominent people in behavioral health in Mississippi. And they recruited me into becoming an interventionist. And I was incredibly fortunate. This was long before the TV show, and it was a time when there weren't too many interventionists. And I was incredibly lucky. They sent me to the best training from Dr. Judith Landau and Heather Hayes. And I was getting great training, and it was just the right moment. And then through foundations, I met John Southworth, and Ruth Ann Rigby asked him to help me, and he agreed to help me. And Southworth is recognized, certainly for the people who were around in our field 20 years ago and 15 years ago, uh, certainly the most successful and powerful interventionist. And so I worked under him, and that was very powerful for me. Worked with professional groups, helping pilots, lawyers, judges, executives in recovery, nurses in recovery, because that was a big part of his wheelhouse. And then I ended up doing some really high-end, long-term recovery coaching in a special niche. It was high functionality entrepreneurs and with high IQ, high functioning people. And these are people that were kind of treatment resistant. They had been through some of the great places around the world. Some of them even went to the $400,000 a month place, the Kushnak practice in Switzerland, but they were kind of treatment resistant. And I had this quirky thing that happened to me as an adolescent and young adult. My father was very close friends with Truman Capote, and I ended up spending a lot of time with Truman Capote, putting him in and out of hospitals and putting him in and out of detoxes. So I ended up as an adolescent and young adult having to learn how to speak to a genius. Because Capote was well known. He had a 215 IQ. He had been tested 3 times. And he was very wealthy, very famous, and he was a genius. And kind of communicating well with him was kind of what I was told to do by my family, help him, you need to help him. And so I learned how to speak to a genius. Sadly, it turns out being a genius is not contagious. I did not catch that. I am not a genius. But it was really quite something for me to be exposed to all his high-level friends and all the powerful people. And I really did learn a lot about being high IQ, being successful, being powerful will not prevent you from dying from addiction. Because after putting him in and out of some hospitals and some detoxes and some things, one day I drove him to the airport, and a couple of days later he died in Johnny Carson's pool from addiction. So that was a profound lesson for me, to see very powerful people, had it wasn't a Superman costume versus addiction, to be brilliant and powerful. And so that's why I ended up doing these sort of niche placements with these high-end guys. I knew how to talk to them, and I felt comfortable with them, and they found it interesting to talk to me. And so I did that. Southworth had me do that for 3 very high-end groups, and so did Heather Hayes. Heather Hayes had me do it for a very powerful person in Atlanta. So that was an interesting chapter for me. Long-term residential coaching with high functionality people who were treatment resistant. And it was always a collaborative team effort with a PhD and a doctor and me. And I learned that multidisciplinary approach, very successful, very powerful. And I was very fortunate with all that. And then as I did more and more with Foundations Recovery Network, I saw the great training that was happening at that time at those conferences. And Foundations, the first place that really did co-occurring disorders, the first place that really addressed psychiatric, psychological, trauma, and substance at the same time, they were bringing in the thought leaders of the day. And it was just Irish luck, the way I was lucky and ended up with Capote, and lucky and ended up with Southworth, and lucky and ended up with foundations at all their conferences, getting all this phenomenal training. And the intervention world at that moment was not overcrowded. And a lot of guys took me under their wing and gave me private trainings. The wonderful Keith Fearman, who's been very famous at Cirque Lodge for so long, he was still doing interventions then. And he, after a while, when he saw that I was trying to do the right thing and trying to do it ethically, he took me aside and said, listen, let me help you a little bit. And he taught me his version, his methodology, the Fearman protocol, if you will. And I had a lot of lucky things like that. I also, at a training in the Hotel Del Coronado, I met Tom Horvath, the guy who helped start SMART recovery. And he also befriended me and gave me a lot of training in SMART recovery. I was one of the early sort of broad-based interventionists that knew a lot about that, which is in a lot of ways the most effective non-12-step protocol, SMART. And so there was a lot of luck. When I really look at my career, it's sort of a mixture of Mr. Magoo accidentally not falling off the plank in the front end of the commercial, and just wonderful luck, just wonderful blessings and luck, and also being mentored. I used to call up Heather Hayes or call Judith Lando and say, hey, do we use this treatment center? And they say, oh, no, we don't use that treatment center. Now, for what you're thinking of, we use this one and this one and this one. And they would take my phone call, even though I wasn't paying them a fortune, but they knew I was trying to do the right thing. And there was a lot of that in those days. There was a lot of, if you were trying to do the right thing, there was a kind of a camaraderie of great people, that helped me. So the interventions were a huge part of my career for a long time. And then coaching in that niche, that sort of high-end functionality niche. And then as the years went by, one day I went on a tour of the Driftwood Recovery Center in Texas, and it was brand new. And Driftwood was fascinating. It's a 75-acre nature preserve sanctuary campus with 35 people on staff, PhD heavy, medical doctor heavy, also holistic medicine heavy, and 35 people helping 12 primary campus clients. And I just, again, by luck, they made me the coach, and there was little Brian O'Shea Cabin. And so I was working with a client with PhDs handing me worksheets and doing this beautiful, it was an incredible training to have this broadly diverse training in this PhD heavy team working with clients. And I was there for years and years. The only reason it ended was the pandemic. With the pandemic, they decided to shift me off campus on Zoom. But so that's when I became a coach. That event, I became a coach. So that shifted everything, and my training shifted. Got wonderful DBT trainings from Eric Schmidt from the New Roads Behavioral Health, they do such good work there with borderline people and complex things. And I get a lot of great trainings while I was at Driftwood. Driftwood, under Brad Kennedy, the great guy who was such an important person at Menninger for so many years, he would bring in the greatest trainings. And Peter Fleur, the founder, he was all about training budgets and all that. So again, I was just incredibly lucky. I got all this phenomenal training and working with a large crew with a small amount of clients as the coach. So it's just a beautifully thing. And great things have happened. I'm still friends with many of the people who I crossed with there. And they say to me, because you end up as the coach getting more of the applause than you should. There's people that say to me, you saved my life. And yes, I was part of it, but there was a whole lot of a really good doctor, a really good diagnosis, a really good nurse practitioner. Shelley, the nurse there, is incredible. So, but I ended up with the long-term connection. I spent a lot of time with them. So that was very interesting for me. And then as life evolved, the coaching thing took off on Zoom for me. And in that piece, again, it's great to have time to do trainings while you're working, and learning how to help people during a pandemic. That also was quite interesting. That was quite powerful.
Let's talk a little bit about your time as an interventionist. All right. When I was at, 10 or 12 years ago, I remember that being a very large part of that behavioral health network. And I'd
Oh,
love to hear about how you think the interventionist piece of the puzzle has changed and evolved over the last 10 years and where it is now.
well, it's fascinating now. First of all, if there were, let's make a fake number, if there were 20 interventionists then, there's 2,500 interventionists now. And that's interesting. And it's interesting how it's shifted. And part of it, how it's shifted, I believe, is people know a lot more about it now. And the TV show is part of that. But more of it is there's been enough people now that their grandfather, their father, their son, or their nephew had an intervention and went to a treatment center. And sadly, some of the treatment centers, more than you would think, kind of do a mediocre to poor job. So that's sort of taken the shine off the intervention miracle, because they've met people who had an intervention, went to treatment, and they didn't really recover fully. So that's taken a sort of some of the energy out of, hey, we'll do an intervention, it'll be great. Now, to be fair, many interventions are very successful. Some treatment centers are very successful. Some treatment protocols are very successful. So I want to give a balanced picture, but I do feel part of the intervention world right now is people have been through it. They've been through it, or somebody they know have been through it, and they haven't had, a 100% big home run life change. Some have, some haven't. Now, I was always blessed because I've had a lot of trainings from Judith Landau, the Arise Invitational form of intervention, which is a lot of family systems therapy and that whole protocol. And I've been very lucky with that. And in my coaching training, I've been very lucky to have been trained twice by Judith Landau and Nanette Zumwalt of Hired Power in their IRI coaching training, which is 5 full days and a long follow-up. And it's the most evidence-driven form of coaching training that I'm aware of. And I have the craft intervention, the craft training. So intervention, it's changed. And some of my pals that who are prestigious interventionists, they are now doing more family coaching as part of what they do. They're doing interventions, but they're often doing interventions because kind of the volume has come down on the amount of interventions. And so I do believe the idea of working with the whole family has gotten more prevalent, and that's helpful. I do believe the model has improved over the years. And what is fascinating to me, though, still today, and I did over 600 interventions, 200 pro bono, 400 I was paid for in 32 states in most parts of the country. But what's interesting now is there's still a stigma about mental health. There's still a bit of a stigma about addiction. And it's much, much better now, of course, with all the celebrities standing up and all the people recovering out loud. It's gotten better, but it's fascinating. There's cultural, multi-generational family stigmas. There's cultural stigmas. There's industry stigmas. So it's fascinating. There's still some people where I feel like I'm 20 years ago. I'm in the middle of a conversation that I can't believe it. That because they're like, we don't think he could ever be healed. And I'm like, really? And they go, yeah, he's just kind of got an attitude, and clearly the guy has some trauma and a profound multi-generational substance abuse problem, So In some ways, it hasn't changed at all. And in some ways, it has profoundly changed.
So what's the transition from interventionist to coach? And that might just be, you know, a little nuance, but explain that transition, going from interventionist to a coach.
Yeah. So for me, I was tired. I was burned out. I had been doing too many interventions. And when these guys said, hey, you want to sit in the cabin and coach people? I'm like, great. And also, I knew because I had traveled and seen so many of the treatments that I'd seen, not to be, I don't mean to seem braggadocious or impolite, I had seen all the great treatment centers in this country, either once, twice, or 20 times. And I could tell this Driftwood thing was going to be a magic place because I had been in a few other places where magic had occurred. And so I said, absolutely, and I moved into the cabin. And I had been doing coaching because part of the Judith Landau model is you're doing family coaching and you work with the family and the individual for at least 6 months or a year after treatment. So I had been doing it on this level with a small amount of clients with a large professional staff who had the time to talk to me and train me and help me. What I found there was emotionally for me, taking people through the work, taking people through pain, growth, and where they were truly rediscovering joy, rediscovering hope. It's just, there's no feeling like it. I mean, of course, the intervention was powerful because the family would be filled with fear and I would be successful and the guy would go to treatment and they would be so happy. So, but this was different. This was a more profound, long-term feeling of I'm really impacting people's lives. When you're a coach, you really are doing something that you can see and perhaps taste more powerfully.
So this brings us to where you are now. And I know, so I don't want to spoil the surprise, but I would love to hear, what you're up to now and what are the plans for Brian O'Shea in the future?
Well, I've made a decision because up until fairly recently, I would be doing consulting for different treatment providers, be it a small group or a treatment center. I would go on campus for a couple of days, or I would be working with them in consults. But recently, I've made a big decision. I have decided that I really want to shift entirely to almost little or no interventions. I mean, I'm going to be doing interventions for anybody who asks me, of course. And I want to be a coach. I want to really expand the coaching. And also, I am going to be spending more time in my home base of Jackson, Mississippi. So I'll be based here. Now, most coaching's on Zoom. I mean, early this morning, I was talking to my Scottish clients. So, I mean, and then, in Scotland, I didn't mean some guy who's, I mean, I was talking to Glasgow this morning. So it's a shift for me where I really want to expand coaching. And part of that includes for the last 2 or 3 years, people have come in to do 3 or 4 day intensives with me. And I work with a local equine team that's nationally respected equine team. And I work with a physical therapist who is really great at focus stretching, trigger releases, and all that kind of thing. And I work with a nutritionist, and I'm doing grief work intensives, or I'm doing family multi-generational recovery from family messages intensives, or I'm doing anxiety reduction. I'm doing a lot of anxiety reduction intensives. So I'm shifting to that, where I'm going to be traveling less and doing a lot more coaching and personal healing intensives.
And, due to your history and your expertise, it sounds like you'll be specializing with like a unique demographic or a unique age group.
Well, I'm definitely doing more and more adults. And let's say, I mean, I have people, I have a 20-year-old, but generally I think My strength is people 25 and up. And a lot of what I do is driven by the wonderful Hollis Jungian. He has written two of the most important books on finding meaning in the second half of life. That's a lot of what I do. I do a lot of mythopoetic Jungian work and that finding meaning, or finding out what's going to be the third act of the play when I sell the company or retire from this and go into the next part of my life. So mostly adults, mostly adults. And the great thing about the way I was raised with Capote is I am very safe and talented in the LGBTQ community because I was kind of raised by him and a couple of my gay uncles, so I have a great safety. People say that a lot. Everyone kind of says, I feel very safe talking to you. I feel very safe working with you. I get that a lot.
So I know you touched on a few things. I think you touched on like trauma informed. And I know one thing that we've had some conversations about, when, working on your marketing is around transgenerational healing.
Oh, very much so.
And I would love to hear, your take on that.
Absolutely. And it was so great. If you're raised by Judith Landau, you've been doing family genograms your whole life. So, so we start with that and we look at, in a non-blaming way, we look at what's the family like? Because an absence of malice does not mean you weren't wounded by your parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles. They might have a stoic emotional absence that was the way they were raised, but it ends up wounding you. So the multi-generational, the messages of the ancestors, the healing from the messages of the ancestors requires, first of all, the courage to look accurately at mom and dad and aunts and uncles and your culture, be it the community culture or your work culture, what it's like. Because it might be very harsh, very stoic, and very where it doesn't nurture you emotionally. It doesn't nurture you in giving you a great feeling of self-worth. It doesn't nurture you in feeling safe, because that's never been their experience or their intention. So the creation of safety and allowing people to understand that, yes, I loved my family system, and yes, my family system hurt me. That idea of the dialectic is always true. Yes, they loved me, and yes, it hurt me. So being able to see that, and then there's lots of ways to heal from that. I teach a lot of the Qigong, which is very soothing and very helpful. I teach a lot of breath work. I, as a hobby, have built labyrinths all around the United States. Labyrinth walking and the world of Enneagrams also helps us heal. And the labyrinth walking, very reminiscent of the mindfulness walking taught by Thich Nhat Hanh, very helpful. And I'm a big proponent of Bessel van der Kolk and Stephen Porges and the polyvagal work, where we understand that the autonomic nervous system is helpful if you address it, if you address your autonomic nervous system. And one of the great things about that is to understand we're not always pushing you to be constantly calm and constantly in the parasympathetic. That's not healthy polyvagal life. Healthy polyvagal life is being able to return to it. But sometimes you're in dorsal shutdown, sometimes you're in frontal shutdown, sometimes you're in different stages, but to be able to come back to the absolute parasympathetic and the calm, to be able to return to that, the techniques to return to that. So we can heal from our family's messages. Part of it is seeking it with clarity, practicing forgiveness for them, and then practicing self-forgiveness and compassion for whatever mistakes you've made. Or when you look at your life, I wish I had been more loving to my child or to my loved one, but I wasn't able to.
When it comes to success in behavioral health, from a treatment facility standpoint, it's always been my understanding that when you get family involved, your outcomes increase significantly, positively. Um, Assuming that's still to be the case, uh, how would a treatment center consult with you to work with their clients and their family?
Oh, absolutely. Um, I'm about to launch a really great website, and my phone number is on there. And I absolutely would love to do that. And Driftwood has the wonderful Laura. She is the greatest family week person I've ever seen. And Driftwood always knew that, always knew family is a big part of this diagram. And Laura, who is their family person, just incredible. She does a thing with scarves on the floor about boundaries that is just one of the greatest things I've ever seen in my life. But yes, I would love to help people. And it's been a part of my whole career, as you can hear. Judith Landau Family Systems, Heather Hayes Family Systems, and the healing of the family, it changes everything. If the family's involved, out comes hockey stick in success.
So, what are some of the most common challenges that you see that families face when they're working towards healing together as a unit?
Well, first of all, it's hard. This is hard work. When your family perhaps has been challenged by surprising medical grief and surprising deaths, when your family is challenged by significant psychiatric or mental health problems or substance use, your family is riddled with a lot of possibly unprocessed traumas. So part of it is for them to say, maybe I need to do a little work. Maybe I need to give myself grace and ask for some help myself. So that's one part of it. Will the family say, hey, I could work on myself a little bit? Am I open to that idea? And understanding that when your loved one is struggling, it's okay to be honest and to say, you've been inconsistent in our lives. I would like to help you have a better quality of life. But it's also honest to say, your raging doesn't work for me. Your vanishing for 6 months doesn't work for me. So it's allowing them to be honest about what their needs are. But it's also them, are they willing to do some work themselves, on themselves? Because they deserve it and need it.
I know another thing that we've touched on lightly, and I'd love to hear more about it. I made a note because I wanted to hear more about it, is you talked about spiritual healing, spiritual
Oh,
repair.
yes.
That's something that I think, especially in, modern society, maybe not frowned upon, but there could be some taboo around the word spiritual. And I would love to hear, your take on, you know, accessing spiritual repair and how practices, a few that you've already mentioned, but, what are some of those more practical approaches, maybe for people that maybe aren't so spiritually inclined?
Oh, absolutely. And my life again was so lucky. When I was 13 years old, I had been to as many bar mitzvahs as I had been to holy communions. So I was very fortunate to have Jewish knowledge and Jewish people in my life. Very fortunate. The thing with spiritual healing that perhaps is most helpful is to understand that you're allowed to be honest, you're allowed to say where you're at, and you can be angry at the divine. You can be angry at that. That's okay. Process that, give you a safe place to process that. And part of the mythopoetic practices that Jung gave us helps us through myth, through poetry, to allow metaphor to come in that would allow, and you find the right metaphor, the right story, the right myth to help someone who perhaps has no spiritual or religious background to be open to that story gives me hope and allows them hope. And then there are simple practices that predate a lot of things, like the labyrinth that I use. There's a lot more labyrinths around than we realize. And practicing the silent walking in the labyrinth can help with healing. And the radical acceptance that DBT brings us, in my practice, helps us become more able to be healed spiritually when we understand the practice of radical acceptance. This is the truth about my life. This is the truth about my parents' and grandparents' life. And self-forgiveness is very important. There's a wonderful concept from the East, the metta, the deep compassion. And the idea of metta is practice metta towards yourself, self-compassion. The more you deepen your ability for self-compassion, the more that increases your ability to have compassion for others. And there's a wonderful, I think you're in Nashville, a wonderful mentor of mine who's in heaven now, Lee McCormick. He and I built 3 different sacred spaces around the country. And what a dynamic time in my life to have been able to spend some time with Lee McCormick and to really see and experience the creation of sacred spaces. And labyrinths, it's a big part of my life because I'm someone who is recovering from trauma myself. I use the labyrinth walks to help me calm down and help me have spiritual and mental emotional repair. And labyrinths are fascinating when you think about them. They're about 5,000 years old. The oldest that we know of now, they were all on the island of Bolshoi off the southeastern coast of Russia. Then the most famous one after that is the famous one on the island of Crete in the village of Knossos. And that's the one that has the mythology about the Minotaur. And then the more famous one for America is the beautiful Chartres Cathedral with the rose in the middle. Interesting thing about labyrinths and about the collective consciousness of the world, which is a big teaching of Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, right after the Knossos island of Crete labyrinth is made, so that's about 3,400 years ago, in the next 300 or 400 years, labyrinth type art starts to appear in every inhabited place in the world. And 3,500 years ago, they didn't have Google watches. So it was the collective consciousness again. And in North America, it was the man in the maze. And they showed a maze and they showed a hero, and he was in the maze. And that shows up in cave drawings and in basket weavings. And in Europe, the labyrinth idea shows up on pottery and on coins. But it's fascinating how the idea of that walking the circle to find your center and try to find calmness is sort of universal. And there is one brilliant astrologer who saw the original Knossos labyrinth, which is a 7th circuit enormous labyrinth. It mimics Mercury's orbit. Mercury does, it takes 3 years for Mercury to contribute to orbit. It has a 3-year orbit cycle. And the Knossos labyrinth is close to mimicking Mercury's orbit, 3-year orbit practice.
Oh, that's awesome. I had no idea. You know, it's when you're talking about, finding, your center, it's, I think it's becoming more and more necessary in the busy world that we have today. And I know that, as you mentioned earlier, you have done a ton of work and are continuing to do a lot of work with really, high IQ, high functioning professionals. Let's talk a little bit about that individual. Um, in your opinion, what are some of the, most drastic challenges that those individuals are facing, and how can working with a coach help that individual?
Well, it's incredibly customized. Each person has different goals that they're working on or different things that they wish they could do better. Part of it is the depth psychology that Carl Jung was the leader in, and the depth psychology that my clinical practitioner is always. The next piece is some people like books, some people like audiobooks, some people like written work, and some people don't. Some people like a lot of they just can track with the mind. So customizing, figuring out what is helping them, but also listening to what they need. Often, what they're looking for is a better sense of communication with family members. Often, what they're looking for is grief work, because part of their creating their success, there was a lot of time that they didn't spend with family members or in family systems. So they feel very sad about that. And part of what I do is I do the grief work. Often they come visit me for a couple of days, and we allow ourselves to grieve over creating financial security for my family and I took me away from them. And I need to forgive myself, and I'm allowed to move forward. A book that I like is The Spirituality of It, because moving off perfectionism is very helpful. Perfectionism is filled with energy around mistake avoidance. Mistake avoidance prevents spiritual repair and emotional vulnerability and accessibility to those you love. And then there's other books, the Jungian books by Hollis, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, very important. Also, I use a wonderful book by Mark Nepo, Falling Down and Getting Up. And that has a lot to do with accepting that, yes, I did this, and now I feel like I'm called to go do this. And it's okay. It's okay to shift. And, the Jung thing that I hang on to a lot is, it's the Erasmus quote. A lot of what I do is with some of my high functionality people, they love Stoics, and we're teaching the Stoics, and we're learning, and we're in Stoic conversations. A quote that I love a lot and that I use sometimes in creating mythopoetic metaphor is the Erasmus quote that Carl Jung had carved on the entrance of his home office in Kuschnacht, Switzerland. And the Erasmus quote, my Latin is not as strong as it was when I was an altar boy, advocat con advocatus, and it translates roughly to called or not called, the divine will be there. And so when I'm doing spiritual repair, I offer the idea that it's always up to us to move towards the spiritual. It's always up to us to move towards the divine. And we can choose to, in whatever small way, if it's once a week or once a month, we can have a spiritual couple of hours. But I love that idea, called or not called, the divine will be there. So it's up to us to move towards healing.
Well, Brian, thank you so much. If anybody wants to get in contact with you, what's the best way to do that?
Area code 601-503-7203. And I'm about to launch a beautiful website about Brian O'Shea Consulting.
Excellent. Well, Brian, thank you so much for your time. And it was an absolute pleasure getting to talk with you. We're going to have to do it again.
I'm very honored. I hope I offered something helpful. I'm very honored.
That's a wrap for this episode of The Lead Climb. We hope you picked up some valuable insights to help optimize your patient acquisition and grow your behavioral health organization. If you found today's discussion helpful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your network. And if you're looking for expert guidance in digital marketing, admissions, business development, or any other piece of the patient acquisition puzzle, Growth Sherpa Consulting is here to help. Visit us at www.growthsherpaconsulting.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on The Lead Climb.